disfrutar.
Work for it.
Medically.
Thanks for tuning in. You're right now logged in with episode 2 of Rent Control Radio. We could just go around and introduce the panel we've gathered together this evening. I'm Jake. I use he, his pronouns.
I'm Deanna. I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, everyone. I'm B. I use they, them pronouns.
Hey, I'm Erin. I use she, her pronouns.
Lovely. And just a recap for folks, this Rent Control Radio, what we're doing is tracking the struggle for rent control in the Twin Cities. We're years deep into the struggle for rent control. We had a big year last year where both cities, the voters of both cities, the tenants of both cities came out and passed rent control legislation. And now we're fighting against the reactionary backlash, which is kind of what we're going to open up with today. So what we first wanted to talk about was the east side of the river, the beautiful city of St. Paul. And just a quick overview. Voters in St. Paul last November approved the most robust, strongest rent control policy in the nation. This was a universal policy applied to every single rental unit, an amazing victory that was really people-powered. We have some veterans of the campaign with us tonight. And we just talked quick last time we were on Rent Control Radio about what happened since then. And what happened was the mayor, at the behest of developers and landlords, put together this working group. They started to chisel away at the policy, which finally came to fruition, and the policy was gutted a few weeks back. So yeah, that's kind of the overview. Maybe I could throw it to B or Erin. Like, can you talk about how did the policy actually change, and what did those hearings look like?
Yeah, I think that the hearings were so much fluff. I feel like I remember at one point, Chris Tolbert, who's a council member of Ward 7, I think, he went on like this long rant, I think, trying to like gaslight himself into thinking that he was doing something good. He thanked like a million people. He kept thanking all these other people that just like, I had never heard their names before. And I've been a part of this process the whole time. And I'm like, who are these people that you're naming? And so it was interesting being in those spaces because you were just sitting there watching these people who are destroying a very good piece of policy, just like go on and on and on and on. But what ended up happening with the policy ultimately was that it just got completely gutted. And something that I think is unfortunately is the biggest highlight of the change is that 20-year new construction exemption. So obviously our original policy called for no new construction exemption for the simple fact that, why do they need to be exempted? There was also just going to be a whole bunch of landlords and property managers and developers really tearing down a whole bunch of existing units, buildings, and, building them back up for the sake of naming it new construction. And so we asked for no new construction exemption. And now, like Jake was saying, Mayor Carter fell into the trap that these developers set for him by doing a capital strike. And now there's a 20-year exemption for new construction. So a lot of new construction is just not going to fall into the rent control policy that we've fought really hard for. This is going to be really, really harmful. And I say this because a lot of the developers and landlords in the task force group were just their biggest concern was passing this piece of the new construction exemption. They didn't really care about anything else. They really were willing to negotiate with the cap the vacancy control, but they were so stuck on the 20-year, and some of them even called for 30 years, which we'll probably get to a little later.
Yeah.
But they were calling for even longer than that. So I would say that that's what's happening. The cap didn't really change too much. I think they're also trying to affiliate it with inflation with the cap. If I'm correct, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think that, no, you're right there. The other piece that was a big hit to the policy was the vacancy decontrol, well, partial. And I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, we called for vacancy control, which again would not allow for landlords to raise the rent once someone has vacate the unit. So if someone leaves the unit, whether it was willing or unwillingly, they couldn't raise the rent at all. So that went away. I think they tried to replace it with just cause, which for those who don't know, just cause would basically be a piece of or an ordinance that protects renters in a way, because just cause, a landlord can't just evict someone because they want to. They have to have quote unquote good reason. So I think they added that to the policy with vacancy decontrol. So it's like you were saying, like in some weird middle, but not really at the same time.
Yeah, and the vacancy decontrol policy is one I haven't seen elsewhere because it's not full. Once a tenant moves out, the landlord is still limited, but it's 8% instead of 3%. And I haven't seen that elsewhere. I think usually in where there's rent control policies with vacancy decontrol, it's just fully uncontrolled after the tenant moves out. And so I think that the city is trying to pitch this as some kind of like, middle ground. But 8% we know is unlivable. Wages are not rising by 8%. 8%, that's a farce.
Yeah, and it's 8% plus inflation. So that means now it's like damn near 20%, which is like you might as well be full decontrol because that's going to price out most people.
And it did. I mean, that's what happened to a lot of Dominium residents. They were, even before the policy got enacted in May, Dominium was raising their rents to the highest degree possible because they knew they couldn't after May. And it was always at that 8% that they were raising it from. And a lot of people who lived and still live in Dominium apartments were there at this last public hearing saying this, like, yo, you can't allow them to raise it more than 3% because we already can't afford the rent we have, and now they're raising it to 8%, and they're supposed to be a quote unquote affordable housing type of building, from my understanding.
Yeah, F Dominium for
Big
sure.
time.
Oh, fuck Dominium.
F Dominium. I wanted to ask y'all, and it's almost, I was preparing for it because it's not like a wonky battle of ideas. This was like heart and soul. And like you talked about people's lives that are on the line. And for you two, who I know put a lot of like hard work and passion in this victory, can you talk a little bit about what it feels like, as far as like, what has it been like for you to see the policy get gutted like that? Like, where do you feel, honestly, just like, how's it feel and how have you been processing it?
Do you want to go ahead? I feel like I've already said this at the last episode of just like what I'm feeling. So I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are, Erin.
I'll start, but B, like you were really on the ground, like from start to finish at this campaign. And but even so, in my experience with it and going out door knocking, it was the most grassroots, the closest thing to direct democracy that I've been a part of, hands down, on a large scale, like as large as a city scale. And that was amazing. I mean, we were just working with a super low budget, a lot of staff paid time, but a lot of volunteers. And we were just actually real people having very real conversations at the doors. And the stories were heartbreaking.
They were.
Totally. And I talked to so many renters who were just on the verge of being priced out or had just been priced out. It felt like we were fighting for this policy at a really critical, moment for St. Paul, where it's a city that's about to lose its heart and soul because it's about to lose all of its working class communities of color. Yeah. And I can't say it any more than that. It is and was people's lives on the line. So I think how I'm processing the gutting, I mean, Unfortunately, it's been a long and slow, depressing process.
Yeah.
I mean,
it
it
really
was like
has.
Yeah.
elation after we won in November, and just downhill since there. I mean, ever since the work group started, like the mayor's office came in with an agenda. And I know you've talked about that on the podcast already, but like from the very beginning, that work group was just hell for the people in it, and it was a total sham as a democratic process. And I think my heart started to break then, you know, and
Yeah.
it's just
Absolutely.
like broken for a whole year.
Yeah. Oof.
And
Yeah.
and something that you pointed out, like the whole year, it does not felt like that. It has felt like so much longer. I mean, it's been 2 years, but it's felt like 10 at this
Yeah.
point. So I feel you on that.
Yeah. It's like, I guess I'm looking at it and I have like analogous experience, you know, as far as other struggles I've been a part of or going up against the system, you know, where you have partial victory and then defeat, and how do you keep moving forward? I feel like in some sense there's like recognizing that they have in their advantage is like this ability to stretch out the timeline, to create these toxic exclusive processes. And how do we combat that organizationally? Like, what are we doing to support each other? What are we doing to build organizations that can hold the momentum over long periods of time, you know? And it's like, I know you all, I want to just affirm for sure that like the work you all did is going to like be scaffolded upon, you know what I'm saying? There's still like so much of a victory there with being real. But the fact, to me, I guess my big takeaway from it then too is just as far as like a moment for political education for people to really understand like liberal capitalist democracy is the dictatorship of the propertied class. It's not democratic truly. We could see clear as day the people of St. Paul voted directly, clearly on a policy. The capitalist class considered it unacceptable and it was repealed. You know, so that's a huge moment of political maturity and clarity that we have to build on top of. As far as it doesn't mean that we don't engage on the fight, but we have to be real about the system that we're up against, you know. So hopefully it could like move consciousness in that way, you know.
For sure. I think for me, it's been a point, it's been like a time that I can point back to when we start really organizing again. Obviously, like I feel like a lot of us who have been a part of this are just taking the longest break possible, myself included, because it is just like you were saying, they really stretched this timeline out. And that's intentional. They wanted us to burn out really bad, and they wanted us to burn out to the extent that we didn't want to organize anymore. And I hit that, especially after the policy got gutted. I felt really hopeless, and I felt like I was just in a dark space, and I felt as if all the hard work kind of just wasn't for anything. And I go back into that time. We were door knocking in the cold. We were door knocking in heat waves. Like we were door knocking for so long, talking to so many people. I mean, 10,000 signatures was not easy to get, let alone during a pandemic, let alone when you had to collect these signatures in person. You couldn't do it virtually, and you had to follow the city rules, and you had to do all these things. So we jumped through all the barriers, and then they just came up with this big wall that they decided, you know, we're just going to set here and hope that it works out. And I think that the most heartbreaking thing about this is just how lifeless all the city council people were when they did it. You know, being in that room when everything happened, when the vote happened, when the policy was being gutted, when the arguments were being presented. So many of these city council members, and I'm going to name them. I mean, Amy Bremoen, who's the city council president, Jane Prince, she can go fuck herself, Chris Tolbert especially, and so many others that were there, with the exception of Mitra and Nelsie, who were truly there to fight for it.
Okay.
You know, the rest of them just kind of sat there, and they felt proud of what they were doing, almost, of just like, we're doing something good. And Nelsie and Mitra were like, no, you're not. Like, you're literally doing the most undemocratic fucking thing ever, of just like silencing people. And there were so many people at the hearings, at that hearing specifically, that were like, your seats are gone. Like whatever comfort you felt in your seats, like kiss it goodbye, because you're all leaving. Like you are just not representing us in the degree. And I remember one of them, oh my God, and it broke my heart when she said this. I forgot who said it, but she said, you know, we we're fighting for ourselves because neither one of you up there were fighting for us. And we took the fight in our own hands because no one was standing up for us. And now you're slapping us in the face. And that's kind of what it felt like. Yeah. It's like all these folks came together. We got so many volunteers because a lot of them were like, it's all or nothing at this point, and nobody's doing anything for us. No politician, no nonprofit, nobody is really supposed to be doing the job that they were doing. And these folks thought that they had the full power, and these politicians who feel so comfortable doing it were just like, no, it's mine still. Yeah, it makes me angry.
So like I could just picture it, and I've seen it so many times, the smug attitude of liberals who it's like, we know better than you. Like, oh, that you thought that's what was right, you voted for that, and that was the Democratic. We're like, no, we're the experts, and that just burns me up. Oh, that shit is disgusting.
Especially Tolbert, who was on the task force, and he was the most useless task force member. But he also had the most access to power. Yeah. And he said a total of like 5 words throughout the entire task force, like as a larger group. And smaller groups, I'm sure he said more. Or who knows if he did. But those are just some people you want to just like spit on. It's just like,
Yeah. Well, since we're already we're starting to stoke our anger and discuss, I want to share a little article. This article brings up some really interesting dynamics that were at play during the St. Paul process, and it's going to start tying into Minneapolis too. So maybe I'll just read a bit and we'll talk through this article. This is in Axios, and I got to shout out Chris, my comrade from Minneapolis United for Rent Control, who shared this article with me. It says Ryan Co's, and for folks who don't know, Ryan Co's is one of the largest real estate developers in the Twin Cities for sure. They have a national reach, billion-dollar company, huge developer, landlord, owner of residential and commercial real estate. Reading from this article here, it says, Ryan Co's is not sure that St. Paul's recent amendments to its rent control ordinance will be enough to reignite its massive Highland Bridge development project. So it says, Ryan's developer, Maureen Michalski, told Axios the company does not know if a 20-year exemption from a 3% rent hike cap for newly constructed housing will bring investment and lenders back to fund new apartment projects. We had been advocating for a 30-year new construction exemption, Michalski said. We're not sure 20 years is enough to incentivize investment at this time. So maybe that's a good place just to stop and comment and to realize that Ryan Companies was one of the driving forces behind gutting the rent control policy in this way we just laid out, 20 years new construction exemption. And one of the tools that they used was they pulled, who knows if they would have stuck with it, but they said they were no longer going to build the housing that they were online to build in St. Paul. This Highland Park development they're talking about, this is one of the most contested, sought-after developments probably in the history of St. Paul. It used to be a Ford motor plant that they're turning into housing. Ryan won the contract, and as soon as the people of St. Paul voted for this rent control hike, they said, okay, well, we're not going to build any longer. And they were successful in that tactic by gutting the policy, and now they want to push it even farther by saying 20 years isn't enough.
It's funny because a lot of advocates and tenants in St. Paul warned the city council about this, of just like, you're going to give them what they want, but they're going to keep asking for more. You're just like, you're trapped in this little game that they have just started, and it's happening.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll keep going with this because it's interesting. And then it says, on the other side, St. Paul Mayor Melvin Carter's spokesman Kamal Baker pointed to a January letter in which Ryan indicated support for a 20-year plan. And I quote the mayor's spokesperson here. It says, this policy was built in consultation with developers, including Ryan, who conveyed their support for a 20-year exemption. We are disappointed by their change of tone, but remain committed to the Highland Bridge site and confident in Ryan Company's capacity to deliver a first-class development. Yes, but, Michalski says, Ryan only suggested support for a 20-year plan when it thought the city was considering a full vacancy decontrol measure that eventually became partial vacancy decontrol. And then it explains what we just talked about. So really, like, why I want to bring this letter to the forefront is it just really shows the class dynamics at play with the city government, where you have the property class and the investor class completely dictating the terms and really moving this right-wing agenda. And it's just shocking to me that it's playing out in public this way. Not shocking, I guess, but it just really shows it plain as day here. I'm trying to see if there's anything else in this. The other piece that it says why this matters. The mayor and city council invested a lot of political capital into loosening up the strict rent control policy approved by voters, much to the disappointment of housing advocates. So kind of saying like this puts the mayor in a bad spot because, like you said, this pissed people off, and now they might not even get what they want from their benefactors, you know? So I just thought that was a wild development.
Yeah. No, I like the ending though. It's the between the lines, like Axios, like they try to present everything as like really simple and be like, this is what you should be getting out of this. So it says it's not easy to make construction projects work these days with or without a rent control policy because both interest rates and construction costs have spiked. I appreciate that just like really like blanket there, you know, it's just like, oh, these shortages, this inflation sure is hard out here.
Yeah, what could we do? The market told us it's not going to work, you know, like just like abdicating all sense of like politics and power.
Yeah.
I read another article that talked about this, and what was interesting about it is they talked about another development called Lexington Station. That's where the old Wilder building used to be off of 94. This was another development that was like locked in to go. When the rent control ordinance passed, the investors pulled out. But the investors reignited the project before the rent control policy was gutted. And I think that's important because this threat of a capital strike, this is what they're always going to say, that is if we pass rent control, no housing is going to get built. But the fact of the matter is, like, if you look at Cura's study that they did, and you look at obviously the decision of even this investor in this Lexington Station project, is there's still profitable margins, even with the strong rent control policy of St. Paul. If you would have universal rent control policy at 3%, still the people who profit off of our housing can still make a profit. So, you know, what's missing from the media narrative is that Mayor Carter and the city of St. Paul could have said, fuck you to Ryan companies. They could have called their bluff. They could have said, okay, then go, we'll find another person who would gladly put up this money, you know? And so it's just them feigning like they're victims to this natural process of the market, or there's nothing they can do. That's what needs to be called out. And I don't see being called out in the capitalist media environment is like, there's the option of making them actually compete. And I guarantee you'll have investors come build things. And then what we would prefer, the socialist option, is to use that as an opportunity to build a public investment tool and a public construction tool. So good, we don't want Ryan companies to profit off of our housing. The public sector could build it without the need to pull such huge profits, could build just as quality of buildings for a much lower cost, you know? And it's like, that's where like, hopefully the conversation could go.
They could build public housing.
Build public housing, exactly.
They could do some stuff.
Yes. All right, so before we transition to Minneapolis, do our St. Paul comrades have any other last thoughts on Ryan companies, the whole capital strike, anything on St. Paul? And I want to say we would definitely talk about this is a quick initial reflection. There's much to be learned, and we'll talk about it so we don't have to exhaust it. But yeah, curious if anything else is burning. No,
just that I have so many feelings about the developer conversation. They're all bad. Yeah. But like, I don't even know where to start with it. But yeah, I mean, okay, to lay down some real facts about rent control, it's in the Cura study. Anyone can see it. All city council members, everyone in leadership in both cities has seen that study, has seen the results from it. They know well that rent control, at whether it's 5%, 3%, it still gives developers and landlords very reasonable returns. That was clear as day. Yeah. Very reasonable returns. And also something that blows my mind that is never in the media narrative is that the vast majority of landlords are keeping their rent increases around 3%. Yeah. Right. The vast majority. We always knew, and from the start, both St. Paul and Minneapolis said that we're going after bad actors that unfortunately are increasing. You know, it's more and more common for people to get priced out at 8, 10, 20%. But so many landlords have been fine with a business model that looks exactly like rent control. And that narrative is never shared, and it just exposes how much of a bluff all this developer
No,
talk
seriously.
is.
It
Really
brings me
is.
back to like a time in the task force where a small property owner brought up like, oh, I haven't raised my rent more than 3% in about the last 10 years. And I remember just going, so then why are you on their side? And he
Right.
just didn't like have anything to say, because it's like, yeah, hello. Well, and also another piece too, it's like rent control doesn't dictate like what your starting rate should be. And that's what I feel like a lot of developers are trying to like make it as. It's like we can't set our own rates at the beginning. Like, no, you can set your rates to whatever you want. We can't really control that. But what we're telling you is you need to stay within this margin when it comes to rent hikes. It's about control, right? It's like, it's
Right.
about, well, this is out of our control. This is taking the power out of our hands.
Right.
We want it gone. And it's similar to when people were when developers were trying to argue that we have low housing supply, or saying that we don't have enough supply. And I'm like, but you're so quick to stop building when
Right.
when power is starting to get stripped away from you. It's like, it's all so funny to me. So
Facts.
that's just kind of what that is just what goes through my head of like the supply argument. It's like, oh my God, but what about supply? And it's
Yeah.
like, okay, then keep building when something like this passes. Why are you making
Yeah.
such a big deal about it?
Right.
I don't know. It's funny to me. It's hilarious.
Hugely. Yeah, it's like so disingenuous when they say that, you know? Yeah.
And I just resent that we even have to have this conversation right now about like reasonable return. Like,
Yeah.
like that's not what housing is
Exactly,
about, right?
right.
It's about our lives, and it should be free. And that's all.
100%. You're right, but it's like, it's good that we are, because I don't want to settle for that, you know. And that's why it's important for us to say like rent control in our conservative real estate dominated environment seems like this hugely radical policy. I think what we all recognize is like, this is a first step. This is a reform that can create some space for us, but it's not the end all, you know. So I hear what you're saying. I appreciate you speaking to like the horizon of decommodified housing, public housing, housing as a human right, and also to get clear though to like engage with them in this battle, that we can't let their lies pass, because there is an economic model where they could make profit, they could invest. And I think B, you really hit it on the head, that it's really about class power, and they know that, you know, where it's not necessarily about that it's going to immediately hit their wallet. It's that they know they have control of the state, and they don't want tenants as a class and renters as a class to set a political precedent where they pass policy and it starts to poke holes on their bullshit freshman econ 101 that they pass over on people, you know, that like we could demonstrate that there's a lot other ways that we could run things. Have you experienced inflation, and how does that impact like the struggle to pay the rent? What's it like right now this summer trying to get groceries and trying to pay the rent?
Yeah, I feel like it's difficult because you got to be more mindful for what you shop for now versus what you used to do. And I feel like it really haven't been like no help when it came to that situation. Like everybody just noticed it and it wasn't no action took about it. You know what I mean? So it's just there now. We got like the gas as well, so like it's a big struggle.
So that was St. Paul. Really appreciate being able to talk through that a little bit. Now we're going to cross the river and talk about Minneapolis. And just to orient people again, St. Paul passed a specific rent control policy. The voters in St. Paul passed this universal rent control policy that was subsequently dismembered. In Minneapolis, a different thing happened. In Minneapolis, the voters gave the city council permission to pass a rent control policy. So there was no policy prescription set. It was just we could. And what the city council did was create a working group. And the way we understand this working group is preemptively doing what St. Paul's working group did, was to assert the control of landlords and developers in the process and to produce a weak policy. And, you know, the first evidence to that is that out of a 26-person working group, there's 6 renters in a city that's majority renters. And, you know, you have all the big developers on it. We went through that in the first episode. You can check it out. So that's the context. And since we did our first episode, there's been 3 meetings of the Minneapolis working group. So I figured, I know Deanna and I have been to every meeting. Erin's been to one. You all have working group experience, B. So, if you want to just jump in with any comparisons or thoughts. But maybe we could just walk through like the working group meeting, starting with meeting one. I don't know if Deanna, you want to give us a picture of the working group?
Okay, well, I was late. I was 30 minutes late because I thought it started 11:30 because it said
I was
started
hella nervous
11:30.
waiting for you to come in because it was packed rooms. So I was trying to think like, where's Deanna gonna sit? Where's she gonna sit? I was trying to move people over.
It's like the first day of school.
That's like,
Right, exactly.
It was a classic sit on the floor kind of meeting because it was just so like full. Like there was some press there.
Oh.
There was a photographer. I hope he took a good picture of my water bottle.
Hey.
They had all the work group. So the firm Neo, do they go by Neo?
Yes,
Right?
Neoo. I
Yeah.
learned that it's a shortened version of a word from the Bible that means to refresh one's mind.
The vibe.
You lost me at the Bible.
I swear. So that's an important. So the facilitators chosen by the city are like a Christian-based
Oh no.
real estate development firm. That's who they are. Yeah.
Are they Christian based?
No,
if
I was
they're
gonna say
referencing the Bible?
Yeah, and I just
a
hear
book,
the
it's
principal say,
around.
as a man of God, like in interviews and stuff. So I don't know if they're explicitly a Christian company, but
Okay, so I
they
won't
got
get
Christian
hired.
vibes.
Diet Christian.
They're newer. So they're a newer group that they formed a few years ago. It's by Humphrey alumni, so my alumnus formed those. They've come to a lot of talks at Humphrey. They're usually brought out once a semester for different classes.
And I think both the principals were former real estate managers for Thor Construction too.
Is that how they met?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's Denitric Powers and D'Angelo's. What's the last name?
I know I'm not gonna try to
I'm
butcher
gonna
it.
just go to click
Super
the link.
producer Isaac, edit in.
Yeah, this is okay. Yeah. What the fuck is his name?
D'Angelo Svenkinson, thank you.
Seriously?
Yeah. Yeah.
D'Angelo Svensk. Yes, D'Angelo Svenskison and Denitric Powers are the co-founders and CEO/director of planning and engagement. So they had their staff, like they were all there in the room. They took up like one half, like a corner of the room. And then they had like, I don't know, it was like 6 tables and, group members there with the big name tags. So it was visible. There were no signs leading up to the meeting. I feel like I have to say all these accessibility notes,
Yeah.
And yeah, so it was just like full, as busy. A lot of people stayed till halfway point, then they left. Well, that's when Andre Jenkins left, was after the halfway point. Yeah. They just did the get to know yous and then like.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk more about the specific facilitators maybe in future episodes, but I have some reflections on it. I think they're more structural in the sense that like really looking at this consultant class. This is how this firm makes their money is by consulting on real estate projects. So they get money from the city, from both cities, from municipalities across the state, and working with real estate developers. And they are real estate developers. They come from that world. So they didn't choose tenant advocates to be on the working group. They chose real estate developers. And to me, I think what's helpful for me to think about is the capitalist democracy contradiction. That's what we're dealing with these working groups, right? The idea that nominally we're a capitalist or a democratic society, right? So there has to be at least a pretense of public participation. But what we can see clearly is that in reality, we're governed by the capitalist class. So what the property class, the landlord class says is going to go. And the job of firms like Neo, is to manage that contradiction, to allow for the appearance of public relations while making sure that the will of the capitalist class is executed. And that's what I think we've seen in these working group meetings, to the way that they're facilitated, to the politics that are allowed into the room. And that's precisely what the city hired them for, So that's important, I think, for me to like get a clear understanding of what's actually happening.
And when you were saying his name, his complicated name, I was like, I have heard this name before. He was on the task force group in St. Paul.
Was he?
And he was an asshole. Yes, I'm remembering now. Yes, so now it is all coming back, and now facilitator for this group?
Yeah, he's the main facilitator.
That's really, really
so he was on the task
important.
Yes, because I heard this name and I was like, I was like shaking, like so with like anger and anxious. I'm like, wait, I've heard this name. Yeah, he's right there. This is from the task force. Okay. His name is right there. Okay. Yeah, he was on there. I completely forgot about him up until this point because we were in one. He was in one of my breakout groups once, and he was so mean.
Wow, really?
He was just mean to me.
That's terrible.
I was like, it's so wild. And like, he never really, and it's funny because I think it might be because he knew he was going to get this one day, but he never was like super against rent control, but he was never super for it. Yeah. But he was also mean to the renters in the group, like really mean. So it's kind of like what you were saying. It's like a public relations kind of thing where he's like, well, I don't want to be too mean because I might end up having to facilitate the Minneapolis work group. So that's funny. That name, I was like, wait a second. I've heard this name before.
Yeah. Wow, that's some tea.
It really is.
Yeah. Oh my God. This is like, you need like insider music when this.
Exactly.
They're thinking like no one from the cities talks to each other.
Nope.
You know,
I
cross
guess,
city solidarity. This is good info.
Yeah.
I mean, what I realized too is it's a really small circle of real estate dealers, you know, and he's plugged in as somebody who's an expert who will do the work of the capitalist class in the city by managing these contradictions, like you said, kind of playing like a not a hardcore anti-rent control, but very much making the political common sense the logic of real estate development. You know what I'm saying? So it's like anybody that comes in as a renter advocate, I could definitely see being treated with hostility and skepticism and as a problem, you know, as a sore thumb, as far as somebody who's getting in the way of real estate development, you know, as it should be done.
Yeah, because he was only mean in the smaller groups that weren't recorded. Because obviously the St. Paul meetings were recorded, and then but that when we got into the smaller breakout rooms, which is when he was mean to me. That's you don't see that because that's not recorded. Right. So that's also something to know.
And it has real political importance too, because you're sending in people who are tenants, you know, people who don't live in this. Like you're somebody who's equipped because you know you're an organizer and you're sharp, but still it's not fair to be treated that way and not easy. No. But then if you're actually talking about participation of the public and tenants, you get in there with these people who got all the vocabulary, this is their job, they're getting paid to be there, and they just dress people down and embarrass people, you know, and like really, it's like politically disengaging for people then.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on the first
I just find
meeting?
that really interesting because like anything that he was responding to in that process, he can now dictate in this. And so with this process, they're very pointedly not allowing, currently, like small groups to intermingle. Like, right, they're assigned a group, and those are the people they'll be with throughout this entire process. Oh. So it's like intentionally siloing. And I know like all government people love to say siloing. And so I'm just like, oh, you're intentionally creating these silos. So it's like harder for there to be kind of an understanding or awareness of like, where is everyone at personally versus like where they're at when they talk in front of the whole group? Because that can be like two really different personas. Wow. As you noted.
I did not know that they weren't letting them talk.
I mean, they can talk, but like, you know, the whole process is supposed to be like you're with your small group
and
this whole time.
They're with that whole group the whole time. So you're really only seeing 5 people. And like really to me, how the meetings have been characterized, especially the first 2 meetings were like, everything done to keep the conflicts from emerging, you know, to keep it a lot of talk of we're all in this together, a lot of talk of like we all want the same thing, which is the exact opposite of reality. This is a class war, you know. Tenants and landlords have the exact opposite interests when it comes to the rent, you know. Exactly. So like exactly what they're doing is trying to smooth and obscure all those tensions, and they've already pruned and primed the group in a way that those tensions aren't as visible as they should be, but really trying to like stop any crosstalk, stop any exchange of ideas. And, you know, a big nonprofit icebreaker energy. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, that's like awkward. Yeah.
That's so weird. We only got small groups when it was towards the end, and we all had to create individual group packages to bring forward. And we all voted on which one was going to get presented to the council and whatever. But before that, it was like large group. A lot of shit would go down in this larger group. Obviously, that's when the most fighting would happen. So I'm sure, that's what they saw and were like. Because I mean, at one point we also threatened to just like leave the group as a whole, like the renters, because we all were organizing together and talking amongst each other about what we need to do next, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think they're trying to minimize real direct actions from the renters, and they're also trying to prevent renters from speaking up a lot, is what I'm noticing. Because if there's only 5 or 6 renters in this larger group, I mean, I'm sure that each group has 1 or 2 renters, and the rest of them are landlords, developers, and all that.
Big time.
Whoa, wow, so democratic, love it.
So there's one renter in each group.
There's one renter in each group,
because it's only like 5 or 6 groups total. So
we at least had 2 per group.
But
God forbid one of us was sick for the day, we'd be fucked.
Exactly. Yeah. For real though.
One facilitation move from Neo that made me laugh out loud was, I don't know if they do go by Neo, but whatever. We're gonna use that. We're gonna roll with it. Is like, in this like nonprofit facilitator icebreaker thing they have going, they've been using some pictograms in their slideshows to demonstrate the process that they're setting up for the working group. And something they've reiterated multiple times, at least at the meeting I was in, is they showed these different paths to get to rent control, which maybe we'll get into. But they just kept saying, and all paths lead to a policy.
Yes, they kept saying that shit to us.
It was like, what's the Orwellian term, like double speak, or like,
right, exactly.
So they did that in St. Paul. That's wild.
They kept going, guys, a policy has to have multiple perspectives to build it. And I'm like,
a bird needs the left and right wing to fly.
Literally. Like, this is not milk and honey. The bug.
But it's that thing. It's like the smoothing, the like, it feels like programming.
Big time.
They're like, all paths lead to a policy.
But this isn't a policy. It's a framework for a policy. And that was something they kept iterating in the first session, was like, we're not actually creating a policy. We're just creating a framework recommendation. We could create 1 or 2. And then city council has to do something about it. And like Andrea Jakes was saying, like, it's going to be like 95% probably. Like, I don't know. I heard her say that at some point to someone. Like, we're going to pass 95% of it. I was like, what is that 5% you're not passing? Also, you're going to just strip it away. Like, if that could happen in St. Paul, like that, they'll easily try to just, I think, maneuver the same tactic here.
Yes. When you say 95, do you mean like the voting threshold?
Like 95% of the framework will be passed by city council.
Yeah. So what comes out of this working group is still only frameworks. So this will get turned into the city council, and then the city council technically has discretion to adopt the frameworks suggested by this group or reject them. But what they're saying is that we're going to stick like 95% to what this working group creates, you know?
Interesting.
Yeah, which could create some potential political opportunities for us, you know, because it's like this working group is obviously illegitimate if you're looking at it from a renter's perspective. So if there's room for the city council to say, to toss it out, I hope they do, you know, because I don't have any faith that anything positive is going to come out of this working group, you know? So if there's a window. The quick reflections I had coming into the meetings are held at the downtown library. And just for me, it's kind of wild because you really see how much capital has been invested in downtown, even in these last couple of years. You know, like now there's a new skyway from the downtown Minneapolis library to the RBC Gateway Tower we've talked about in our podcast. This is the only 5-star hotel in the city of Minneapolis. The Royal Bank of Canada and United Properties real estate headquarters. It's a $1 billion tower that the city gave this land to these developers. 5-star restaurant in there. Like every time I go by, it's Porsches and shit in the driveway. And you know, the downtown library is where a lot of poor people gather. You know what I'm saying? And to me, it's like, it's heartbreaking because I grew up in Minneapolis. I've been walking to that library my whole life, and you just really see the spaces for poor people disappearing all around us. And all I hear watching the news is how downtown is wild, downtown is crazy. You got more, you need more cops. And I go down there and I'm literally like, it's the Gilded Age down here. It's like, so I've never seen so much money or so many white people, you know? And it's like really and then I realized like, okay, that explains a lot. And that's, to me, sets the context for going into these meetings, you know? Yeah, and then the first meeting was, like we talked about, pretty uneventful. It was like siloed into these small groups, people doing the introductions. I didn't have any other real notes. There was, the other quick note I had was the person from Ryan Companies is really slick. The person they have on the working group, and this is the firm we talked about that did the Capitol strike. When he introduced himself, everybody else said what organization they were from. He didn't. And you were supposed to say if you're a landlord or what your experience is with housing. And he said, hey, I'm whatever his name is, and you know, I've been a renter until a couple years ago. I just bought a house, you know. So I'm like, I forgot who he was for a second. I'm like, okay, we might have an ally here, you know, like working class guy. And then I'm like, oh, this is the fucking guy from Ryan Companies. Like, you have to announce that you're here representing the billionaire developer and the biggest obstacle to rent control in the city.
Biggest lobbyist.
Was it Tony Barranco?
His name is I got it right here. Hold on, Joseph Paris. And the thing is then he was the only person who actually brought some politics into the first meeting, and right after bat was questioning kind of why are we here, you know, undermining the case for rent control right away. So I thought that was interesting that he was slick enough to hide his affiliation, but then also was there aggressively pushing his agenda, or Ryan Company's agenda.
I'm curious if they're going to have the same, them being the opposition, are going to have the same type of strategies they did with St. Paul, where it's like they would disrupt the meeting, being like, what are we doing here? This is dumb, etc. Like they did that to really, again, burn people out.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if they're going to try to pull that shit this time.
I would say that something I've noticed that they're staying in line with is deflecting to wage and inflation, and saying like wages are stagnating and people aren't making enough money. So if we're going to talk about affordability, we got to be talking about how much money people are making.
They tried doing that too.
Yeah. So that's when really last meeting, it was more visible, like evident, where it was like 3 people in a row kind of saying something like that. And then some, I think Maura Brown like kind of called them out like in a very gentle way, you know, like of like, oh, that's great that you're invested in other pieces of the puzzle. And I encourage you to like advocate and do that work in your own time. But we are here to talk about rent stabilization. And I was like, wow, props to like navigating that.
Yeah.
I kind of love that. I feel like a couple times in the St. Paul campaign, like I heard like developers or landlord people almost kind of like walk themselves in a circle towards basically like universal basic income. Like, have you heard that? And I'm like, no, just keep going. Go like one step further, and what's gonna come out of your mouth is public subsidies. Like, just keep going. You'll get to the horseshoe end.
It's like once they're trying to get the focus off rent control, they become socialists in other areas. It's like people need much higher wages, and we need to be providing people health care, and everything costs too much. I'm like, oh, all of a sudden.
Did you say?
All of a sudden, you have a Hamlin sickle on your Twitter bio.
Right. So the first meeting was pretty uneventful. We got introduced to the facilitators. We saw what it was going to be like. Second meeting, any big takeaways from Erin or Deanna, anything that you saw? It was like, basically they did a small group exercise, right? It was pretty boring.
Yeah, I mean, they talked about like their values. I mean, it's very like extremely depoliticized language.
Yeah. I'm good because first meeting they did that like, what is a house? There was like the page, like a little worksheet page of like foundation is values and house like experience and rooftop like, you know, your dream or whatever, something like that. It was like a little cute. It was very cutesy, you know, like it's like, yeah, that's nice.
Oh God.
And then so second meeting, it was they like kind of broke it up where they had like them move around the room, but they still stayed in the same groups. I was thinking about it later, like they could have just moved the pages, I guess.
Make them walk.
Everyone just gotta like get that blood circulating. It's a 2-hour meeting. It's a lot.
And it was like the way they laid it out was the way the working group is going to go is core policy. So they want to talk about like what's in the rent control policy, what's the core of the policy, exemptions and nuance. So then like, okay, they talk about what could be in a rent control policy, what could be the potential exemptions, and then enforcement. Those are like kind of the three buckets as far as like if the policy gets passed, how is it enforced? You know, is there a renter board that's created that's going to monitor this? Like, is it a new city staff? Is it going to cost the city money to enforce compliance?
Right.
And then they had the small groups go around the tables, and they said what this was about was getting all the ideas out. So any idea that a working group member had about what's in the core policy, they're going to write it in these small groups, and that's going to be used to like facilitate the meeting. So what was awkward for us is like in these meetings, we're not allowed to speak. We're not allowed to ask questions. We being members of the public who aren't on the committee, but we're allowed to observe. So when they break into these small groups, it's depoliticizing and intentional, I think, to take the conversation out of the public sphere. But we're allowed to walk around and observe. So I was like, fuck it, I'm gonna walk around and observe and be at people's. And what I really noticed is this dynamic at play where you have any tenant's advocate completely outnumbered at a table, and their adversaries much more well equipped. So you have 5 people around the table beating the drum of there has to be exceptions, new construction of course should be exempted, even saying there shouldn't be rent control at all, we should do these other things. And then you have a few people fumbling to say, I'm not, trying to advocate. But I didn't hear one person. I did hear Jennifer from Inquilino say, I don't think there should be exemptions. And that was like the only time and I didn't see one time written on the paper, even the option of there should be a universal policy, because the space is so depoliticized, and even the tenants advocates are not being politically trained in what their options are, So St. Paul, y'all had that anchor of like, no, this is the best policy. It's the best policy because it helps the most renters. By creating a new construction exemption, you weaken the policy, you make it less effective. You had that tool. The people who are supposed to be advocating for renters in this Minneapolis group have no such political orientation. And Merck, Minneapolis United for Rent Control, who was pushing the universal policy, was intentionally and systematically excluded. They said, the city council said, we're not appointing anybody from Merck because they won't budge, So I was just struck in that second meeting that like, okay, yeah, this is what it is. We're fighting a really uphill battle, and a universal policy isn't even on the table,
Right. I mean, in the structure that the quasi supposed, impartial facilitator group set up, they set exemptions up as a topic that has to be addressed.
Yes.
Exemptions is a huge question mark. I mean, it's a no, right?
Yes, right, exactly.
It's a no, and they're assuming that there absolutely will be exemptions from the get-go.
Yeah, it's
wild.
Yeah.
I mean, like, this is the thing that I'm feeling now. I feel like they observed what happened in the St. Paul working group and are just like trying to prevent that from happening again.
It sounds like it.
Like Kira, when they facilitated our space, they did like education first. Like they started off the meeting by being like, these are the 4 components of rent stabilization as a policy, like no matter in what state. And they went through everything, and it was very like neither side, it was just facts, et cetera, whatever you want to call it. And so it's interesting that, now they're setting it up to just be the complete opposite of what happened in St. Paul with the working group there, because everything that I'm listening to, I'm like, they didn't do that at ours. And like, this sounds like it's retaliation against what happened in our group. This is extremely concerning for me.
Much more. It sounds like they definitely learned the lesson too, as far as not allowing for political debate, like a much more repressed and buttoned up environment,
Because they would even, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. But they do it in like the organizing kind of way by having like ground rules and like adapting the ground rules if something happens, which they've done once now, and having a parking lot for later ideas, So like when Rico Morales like had this like really lovely speech about like how housing's a human right, and like to be in this room, like you have to be like invested in rent stabilization in some way and not like just constantly deflect and all this stuff. They're just like, that's great, but we need like, we'll put that in the parking lot, like we don't have time to address that right now, but we'll do that at the end of today's session. And they did bring it up, but at that point it's like the energy in the room's just like, I want to get the fuck out of here. Like no one wants to like hang out and debate if housing's a human right, like that, at least not that room,
No. And Ryan companies will just say, "Oh yeah, we think housing's a human right. That's why we need to build more housing." You know, nobody will challenge them. It's like, bro, you're the one profiting off of the housing.
There's
Like,
the housing developer or housing. What is the term they're using? Housing providers.
yes.
Yes. One of those landlords was like, "I'm a provider of housing."
They tried bringing. They tried to say
like, actually, bro, the tenants provide you housing, motherfucker. You don't have a job. Like they pay your bills.
No, I remember the first session, a landlord, she was like, I don't know if I'm comfortable with the term landlord being used to describe what I do. And I was like, I literally cut that shit off right away. I was like, first of all, you are a landlord. Like this is land and you lord over it. So
let's get rid of the feudal system.
Yeah. And I remember I think it's just another tactic to throw things off, right? I'm just like,
the semantics.
Let's look at what a property owner really is. It's like, go eat a dick. Like, what do you mean? And like, it's just wild to me.
Hell yeah. All right, so I think we can maybe move on and talk quick about the last meeting, which happened this Tuesday, meeting 3. This is when things started to get a little bit juicier.
Yeah.
Because they had 2 presentations. So they had Kira. We've talked about Kira. For folks who don't know, the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota, you know, a very much institutional engine for research that advises city policy. And the city of Minneapolis contracted them to do a study, you know, in the years leading up to rent control, which they did, which kind of formed the base, was one of the foundational elements of creating this working group. So they had Kira come talk about their study. And what their study says is that rent control works. It's a very effective tool to stop displacement. It surveys the different rent control policies around the country and talks about the potential exemptions, you know, talks about the rate of return that landlords could still get. Also had some orientation to the housing market in the Twin Cities, where they showed that the biggest takeaway is that for wealthy, whiter renters, it's not so much of a problem. There's a lot of housing supply and incomes and rents are kind of matched. But for the poorest quartile of renters, Black renters, Native renters in the city of Minneapolis, it's a complete crisis, and rents are way outpacing wages, and something needs to be done. Mm-hmm. So Ed Getz from Kira gave his presentation, and my biggest takeaway was there was one guy there who was, his name is Eric Myers. He's from the Minneapolis area of realtors. Myers. You know this guy? What a fucking asshole this guy is. He came in mad about Kira. I was sitting there listening to him in the back, and he was like, I think it's fucked up that Kira's taking a political position, and he wanted to like debate Ed Getz so bad. Mm-hmm. And I'm not the biggest Ed Getz fan, but he cooked this dude, because he was like, first of all, I want to say I don't think it's right for you all to make policy prescriptions. And Ed Getz was like, actually, if you read our report, we absolutely did not. The city didn't ask us to, and we didn't. And he was kind of like, and he was just big mad the whole time, basically. Yeah.
No, he acted like a child, and at one point he was just like, that's not true. Like, but he said it to himself, you know? Like, it was like a really sad, like, no.
Yeah. What's your experience with this guy?
I guess, I don't know. I know Eric Myers because of MHA, the Multifamily Housing Association.
Okay,
and he and Cecil Smith, who's also there from MHA, they're in bed together. I think that they're probably playing off against each other. I think that they're really calculated in how they're showing up to this group, because they are trained lobbyists. They do political persuasion professionally.
Yes.
And I think, just like what you said, Deanna, they're being disruptive on purpose.
And very much free market ideologues who come into this space aggressively. And I thought there was another really important exchange between him and Professor Getz, because I wrote it down here. And I can't remember exactly what Eric Myers, this right-wing asshole, said, but he was breaking down why rent control doesn't work. And he said, because isn't that what Economics 101 textbooks say?
Oh, no.
And what Ed Getz looked at him and said, that might be what some Economics 101 textbooks say. I'm more concerned with what actually happens in real life with rent control policies. Yeah. And that was a moment where even the room stopped and took notice, because so many of their arguments rely on that bullshit, made up Econ 101, supply and demand. And what Ed Getz was saying is like, that's not how it works in real life. And one of the points of contention was they were saying, well, if you build more housing, automatically the price goes down, right? That's supply and demand. That is absolutely not what happens. What happens in Minneapolis and cities, gentrifying cities across the country, is more housing gets built, less luxury housing, and it actually increases the cost of rent. It makes the problem worse. And that was this moment where Ed Getz was like, no, that's not what happens. You know, so that I appreciated that moment. Any other thoughts on Kira before we talk about the Federal Reserve?
Oh, no, just that I think it is interesting, like that Eric and other people in the room are trying to paint Kira as this like leftist think tank. And then like, you know, that they need something else there to balance it out. So yeah, I couldn't remember if Federal Reserve was like part of the original invitation to be present at this week's meeting, but they ended up, you know, having someone there to present and give, you know, a counterweight narrative to what, you know, the very lefty things that Ed Getz is saying.
Yeah.
He's not saying very lefty things.
Yeah.
Just to be clear.
That's what they have to do, though. They did it in our group, too. They would have someone that was for rent control, and then they had two guest speakers, one for rent control, one completely against rent control. So this is all tracking. Yeah, makes sense.
I think that's an important point that you make that's worth doubling back on, too, is that the best we have in our ecosystem right now that's, like, recognized is Kira, which gets painted by the opposition as this radical force. But we have to be clear that Kira's rent control study is very tepid. It's not a document that's fighting for rent control. It's presenting a reasonable economic study which shows that a rent control policy could be passed and could be successful and it's a liberal think tank, right? That is very much in the liberal consensus. We don't have a strong socialist, communist, or it just rooted in tenants advocacy organization that's putting forward hard arguments for rent control. Some of us are that, you know, we're trying to do that, but just to name that's not. So what we had was like a liberal kind of quasi pro-ish rent control and then a very anti-rent control presentation. Yeah.
Right, and like Deanna's saying, like the most conservative members of that group are trying to set the terms of the debate and shift the dial towards conservatism.
Big time.
Way more than it already is.
I don't know if, from my memory in the first meeting, all I heard was Kira was coming to present. I didn't hear that they were the Federal Reserve. So I was wondering if the landlords on the group lobbied for this balance to bring the Federal Reserve in. But after Kira spoke...
Right. Okay. I'm looking at my notes from the first one. So Mapping Prejudice was supposed to give a presentation with Kira. They were scheduled to present the same day. It was supposed to be meeting number 2, but that got postponed because of Yom Kippur and stuff like that. But anyway, so that was the original idea. And I remember Eric or other people having that kind of pushback at that. And they're like, well, we can add other people. Like, this isn't set in stone. Like, you know, if you have more people, like, we want to have it be all balanced and neutral and la la la, you know, like, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, so it went from Mapping Prejudice is a group that talks about, you know, racially restricted housing covenants and the history of white supremacy in the housing market. Yes. Instead, we got the Federal Reserve. That sucks.
Fuck.
So Libby Starling, the director of community building and community relations at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, which is like, wow, that's a thing that they have, came in to talk about, they inserted themselves in the rent control debate when the referendum was happening, you know, before the vote. And they've put forward basically a kind of slick, it's not like really aggressively right-wing on its face argument, but it's an anti-rent control argument that says there has been some rent control policies out there and they do add stability, but we have to be careful because their argument, the best way I could, tell me if this is what you heard, Deanna, is it does allow for tenants not to be evicted, but if, say, somebody wants to move into a different neighborhood, it was exclusionary displacement because rent control restricted the housing supply, so there's less choices for people who might want to move where they want to move, which to me is like a completely made up bullshit ass argument. You know, it's like the supply side. And when she was challenged saying like, could you flesh that out more? And basically what she said was like, well, the idea is that it was like every time she got challenged, she looked really shaky to me, you know, and she was saying that they studied people in the Bay and basically poor people move to poor neighborhoods or something. Yeah.
Right. Like that's all they could afford were really poorer units or poor. Yeah. Which I think I'd read that study. And so it was interesting. Yeah. That's her extrapolation from that fact of like, okay, when poor people are kind of like soft evicted or evicted even from like a rent controlled unit in some way, or they need to move, they end up moving. They're more likely to move to a lesser quality unit that's, you know, in a shittier part of town. Which is like, okay, so that feels like a case for rent control to me when I hear that. Is like, and also like a case for just like quality inspection control. Like if that, you know, it's not that rent control is limited how many units are there, especially in the Bay. There's tons of units. They're just wildly not affordable. There's that. And another thing I know as a coastal elite, I always notice when Midwesterners cite coastal elitism as a reason to like not do a thing.
Yep.
They're like, that's the coast. And she literally said, some people may refer to this as flyover country. And I was like, why would you say that? You live here. Isn't that offensive to you? I feel offended. I live here now.
God.
So she was just like, New Jersey, New York, California, they've had these rent stabilization policies. They're also different. And it's hard to assess and compare when literally Ed Getz was saying, we just did the study about how we assessed and compared. We assessed and compared.
Well, it's so funny when people ever bring that argument up of like, it's happened in the coastal cities and they've never succeeded. I'm like, let's look at why they didn't succeed. It's almost like they were never set up to succeed. It's almost like politicians had something to do about it. Like, hello.
And ignores the fact that like they did succeed in a lot of ways. A lot of people stayed in their homes. The only people who can still live in them cities are people who live in rent controlled apartments. And if you really want to talk about why they didn't succeed fully, it's because they had exemptions. So if you really care, pass a universal policy, you know? There's a few takeaways from this Federal Reserve presentation to me. One is that as she's getting ready to give her presentation, she has a picture of a triplex on the screen.
That was really funny.
And this guy in the front goes, that's a nice triplex. And like kind of nobody bit. And then he was like, beautiful triplex there, you know? And finally, she goes, yeah, I know where it is. And he goes, I own it. And I'm just like, Jesus Christ. Like,
fucking Christ.
Yeah, this is this guy who referred to himself as a housing provider. He's plugged in with the mayor because he provides duplexes for the stable families, stable homes, like a program that, he gets some city subsidy to keep some of his buildings affordable. But just, to me, that was like a quintessential moment for the working group where the presenter is using the image of one of the landlord's homes that's in the group. And this is supposed to be a tenant group, it was just like embarrassing. And then
and there was like some like cute little chuckles out of that. Everyone's just like, and you were just like, ha ha.
No, Hey, I'll say this. I was starting to get a little froggy. I've been known to interject myself into meetings when I'm not supposed to. Like these Upper Harbor Terminal meetings I used to be in, we weren't allowed to speak either, but sometimes I just couldn't take it. And I felt
Jake in the back. Like,
yes, I was starting to get mad. Like, I was trying to make eye contact with the Eric Myers guy to see if I could get him to say something to me. And actually, I'll say, I didn't tell you this, Deanna. I went to the bathroom at one point, and the dude from Ryan Companies came out there with me. And I had some Nike Dunks on, and he said, hey, man, like your MJs. And I was like, these are Dunks, actually. And he was like, oh. And I said, you work for the Ryan Companies, don't you? And he said, yeah. And he started walking away. And I was like, I think the way you're acting is despicable. And then he just picked up his pace and he kind of yelled over his shoulder, like, if you want to talk about housing sometime, I'm willing. And honestly, though, it's like I was thinking about you, B, like, you were describing like the real emotional toll this stuff takes on you, even reading about it. And I realized, like, I'm offended when I'm in these meetings. Like, what the fuck? And it's like, it's a struggle I always have because it's like I want to show up in a way that's appropriate and constructive. You know what I'm saying? And I want to be articulate and I want to build this political space, But it's also personal and it's a class war and these fucking people piss me off. You know what I'm saying? And sometimes it's like this meeting is so sterilized that it's like I feel like it would be good for somebody to interject. And I damn near did this meeting because I just couldn't take it. But this Federal Reserve person gets to talking and she really also said the quiet part out loud. And she said, what we really have to think about, the key component is the equity investors, And this is usually 1/3 of any housing project. So you have the...
Whoops, she said it.
Exactly. She said it. And she said, and basically what she said is, rent control scares away equity investors, and the equity investors, and she did a really interesting move too, is she tried to implicate everybody in the group, which was again betraying her class allegiance, because she said, and who are the equity investors? It's not just Wall Street and big banks. It's also anybody who has a life insurance policy.
Yeah.
And, so people who have money in the stock market, who are one of the speculative assets that they purchase, are our housing supply, right? Which is the problem. Those are exactly the enemy. Those are the people we need to exit out of the housing ecosystem. Our housing should not be a speculative asset. And for her acting like that implicates everybody in the room. How many renters do you know that have a life insurance policy or are invested in the stock market? I don't have those things. You are simply, that's another way that you are exploiting and leeching off of the working class. You know what I'm saying? People who have to work for a wage and who don't have savings. And her argument was that we can't be too aggressive with the rent control policy because it will back equity investors out. And what was really unfortunate is that nobody picked up that fight. Nobody said, fuck them equity investors. They shouldn't be in our housing anyway. That's where the city should come in and put that money up. Or even the simple thing of like, let the scary ones run and somebody else, a more reasonable one, will jump in. And that what's unfortunate is that it seemed like most people in the room just kind of accepted her argument as natural law, that we can't scare away the equity investors. And then she ended her presentation, which I thought was a really offensive analogy or metaphor. She said, she quoted somebody else, and I'm going to paraphrase. She said, even though we don't deny people in pain painkillers, even if we know that in the long run they can be harmful and avoid real healing or something. So trying to say that rent control would be a painkiller. So we might allow for some painkiller, but we know that the real solution is building more housing. So we shouldn't get lost on the painkillers. I'm just like, what a fucking arrogant thing to say when people are sleeping outside, and
what the fuck?
And it's not even true, And then there was Maura Brown from the Alliance tried to challenge this trickle down housing. The idea, she said, like, okay, well, we can acknowledge that the housing that's getting built is at the top of the market. It's luxury housing. You're saying that eventually that's supposed to trickle down to people. Can you talk about that? And she really had no answer. She said, well, in theory, after 5 people move out, and she even gave up the game and said, well, in theory, that's what should happen, but we're not seeing that. But so she said, basically everything I'm saying is bullshit and is not true, but nobody called her on it, And it's like, they're allowed to get away with this Reaganomics bullshit, And it's like, yeah, those are my big takeaways from this week.
For the equity investment part, her example was that the Mall of America was owned by the Teachers Retirement Fund for many years. So as a way to be like, there are already equity investors in this room, and that the Teachers Retirement Fund was tied to the Mall of fucking America.
Don't pull the teachers into this. It's not working people's fault that their investments are out of their hands. That's insane.
No one cares about MOA anymore either.
It was a fun little local example of equity investment.
That's such a fucked up and offensive and clumsy metaphor about opiates. That's insane. Yeah. But also, I mean, like the developer liberal, landlord side is getting really good at twisting language from the left. And that really reminds me of another moment I overheard at the rent control meeting was a white lady in her early 40s who is representing a developer. I forget which one. And she said something along the lines of, rent control, it's really a Band-Aid. It's really a Band-Aid on a bad situation. It's not getting at the cause. It's not getting at the core, the cause, right? And I was just sitting. I was just stunned, and everyone at the table just nodded, like, yeah. We don't like Band-Aid solutions, right? And I'm sitting there like, this is so twisted to you that you're using this language of a Band-Aid solution. And the messed up thing is, like, in a way, I agree, right? Like, this is also a compromise for leftists to control the market, right? Yeah. But it is, just by far, like, the most specific policy mechanism that we have available to us to keep houses affordable in the short term.
Yeah. Damn. And to hear people who have fought every other attempt to alleviate the suffering of tenants, tooth and nail, to pretend like, oh, they're we don't want these minor reforms. We want to go to the root cause. It's like, fuck all the way off, you know, like just a complete cynical, yeah, that's bullshit. Well, I had another article teed up, but I think we've talked for a while, you know, so maybe we'll bring this next, because I read a really great piece that really breaks down this bullshit supply and demand, just we need more supply argument. So if you're tuning in, folks, tune in to episode 3 of Rent Control Radio, and we might be able to read, you know, get into some of these arguments more. Any other stuff before we wrap it up that's on people's mind?
I just want a little promo. We're going to do a Rent Control radio launch party soon, so keep an eye out for that. We got some yard signs, and we have a phone number, a hotline, that people can call in about your own housing stories. So, I don't know. We'll link to the number in the show notes.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
Okay.
Sweet. You got anything, B?
It's sad to see that the same themes are coming up in the Minneapolis rent control group, and I think that it's the most common one is how out of touch some of these developers and landlords are, yet they want to dictate how people's lives should be running in terms of like housing. It's just baffling to me. So
yeah,
it's like, oh my god. But yeah, those are just my thoughts. I kept thinking about that when y'all kept talking about the opposition, what they were talking about. I'm like, that is so out of touch. Like, go into the community and tell them that,
right.
Tell them this, and see the reaction you're gonna get. So that's just my thought.
Real shit. Anything, Erin?
Nah. Universal rent control.
There you go.
Fuck the landlord.
Hell yeah. For real.
Public housing or die.
There you go. Hell yeah. Hey, I will say 2 things is during the second meeting, I seen 2 sharp comrades walk into the meeting, and I thought, ooh, they look like they're cool. You know, they came here for a good reason, and they look like they're on our side, and they were sitting down. And then I walked up and talked to them, and they're like, hey, we came because of Rent Control Radio. So I want to say shout out to them who came to the meeting. And also, I'm sorry I subjected you to that. You know, like, they were looking at me like, what the fuck is going on in here, bro? Hey, so if anybody wants to come to these meetings, if you want to be the one that has an outburst rather than me, you're more than welcome.
Come hang out.
Yeah.
Start a drinking game.
Right, exactly.
For these
Bring
meetings.
popcorn.
Exactly. I've been known to smoke a blunt before I go into these meetings. If anybody wants to join me. Yeah, so just that. Shout out to them. If other folks want to come, you know, if there's organizing that's happening, we'll lift it up. And because we talked about some real challenges today, I just want to end us on this uplifting note that we're fighting for public housing.
Yes.
We're fighting for universal rent control. We're fighting for a proletarian revolution, you know, and we're going to win. So with that said, want to thank Isaac, the producer, Deanna, B, Erin, Rent Control Radio, episode 2, signing off.